we can simulate all of the third-party non-SAP systems, all of them. What metrics do companies use to measure the impact of service virtualization in the SAP Greenfield programs? The remedy for this is to cut the scope, but we don't want to cut the scope, because if we cut the scope, then actually we're implementing an empty shell with nothing, right? So there will be no business value. My name is Michał Krawczyk, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of Navigating SAP API Testing, the show where we try to talk about why and how SAP organizations can test integrations, which obviously are the backbone of different SAP digital transformations. Today we're hosting a live Q&A because we've realized that some of the questions around the topic of service virtualization, they come up very often. So we thought, why don't we try to take some of them during a Q&A session? And we will be talking about the utilization of service virtualization, because we know and we see that there's still a lot of companies that find it hard to understand the values, hard to understand the use of service virtualization, especially for SAP Greenfield programs. Let's dive in. The first question that we very often get is, what are some of the most frequent challenges that service virtualizations solve in SAP S/4HANA Greenfield programs? When I think about those challenges, usually around 3 to 4 things pop up to my mind. The first one is the lack of non-SAP test landscapes. This is something that is very common in different SAP transformation programs, especially also in the Greenfield programs, that SAP S/4HANA programs, they usually have a very complex landscape. So for example, we can have a development landscape, we can have a SIT landscape, string integration testing landscape. The next thing is we might have a QA landscape or a test landscape, sometimes also a pre-production landscape, and only then we've got the real production landscape. So we might have anything from 3 to sometimes 6 different landscapes, which require the connection to those non-SAP testing systems. If we're talking about non-SAP systems that are connected to the SAP ERP systems, to, for example, to the SAP S/4HANA system, we're not talking about tens of systems. It's very often hundreds of non-SAP systems, of those third-party systems that are connected to the S/4HANA system. So the problem is not only to get the number of all of those test systems connected to a single landscape of SAP, for example, to development, but also to connect them to all of those landscapes. And what happens with SAP programs, very often with SAP customers, very often those non-SAP systems, they only exist on a single landscape. That is usually called a development test landscape. So service virtualization can actually eliminate this, because if only one of our landscapes is actually connected to those third-party systems, third-party test systems, then, for example, this can be a test system, an SAP S/4HANA test system. Service virtualization can give us the possibility to connect all other systems, for example, sandbox development, string integration testing, pre-production. They can also get the real information, the real messages that will actually be simulated with the use of service virtualization. So number one, I would say, is the lack of the non-SAP test systems. The second one is very much related to this one, is the lack of connectivity to the B2B partners. And what do we mean by the B2B partners? In most cases, these would be the partners where you do not have access to the system. So for example, EDI partners, right? EDI partners, again, very often they would in most cases be connected to a single system. In most cases, this is also a test system. But what about the development system? What about the functional tests, which we need to do on the string integration test system? How are we going to test the those our complex business processes that span across multiple systems, multiple partners with this? Are we going to test them for real, or are we going to do some manual interventions, and we're actually not going to test the business process as it would be running in the reality, meaning with the use of, for example, of an EDI partner. So this is number two. Number two is the lack of the EDI partners or B2B partners or connectivity to those partners. Actually, if we go one step further, if we think about, okay, what if we would have all of those test systems? What if we would have 100 of non-SAP systems on each of those different test lines of SAP? So 100 systems for development, 100 systems for string integration testing, 100 systems for a QA or test system, and maybe pre-prod. And the same with EDI partners. How would this actually work? One of the things we would also need to get is we would also need to get the resources, people that can actually help us with the testing. So this is another thing that service virtualization can eliminate, because if you think, if you have a company that, if you're running an SAP Greenfield program and you have like 50 or 100 non-SAP systems, you know that you would need to get 100 or 50 people to help you during 2-3 weeks of testing, right? Or during the development phase, a few months, which is very difficult on its own, just to get those people, because it's most likely that their main focus will not be the S/4HANA implementation. They have other tasks, right? So they will be doing other activities. But what about the coordination effort? Who is going to coordinate all of them? Who is going to ask them, hey guys, can you be available next Tuesday because we're doing a lot of testing in the SAP system? Yeah, but our team actually has something completely different, and we've already scheduled that a few months back, so we cannot be available. Okay, what do we do? And we have to do the same activity 50 times. So this is again something that can be eliminated or greatly reduced with the service virtualization. But actually, the challenge is one of the biggest challenges is also the time for testing. So if we're talking about SAP S/4HANA programs, let's discuss different phases. Let's say that our string integration testing, this can take, for example, from 2 weeks to 4, maybe to 6 weeks, right? If we have to communicate with all of those systems, with hundreds of non-SAP systems or tens of non-SAP systems, hundreds or dozens of EDI partners, how are we going to do this in 2, 4, maybe even 6 weeks? How are we going to do this? It's, in most cases, it's just not possible. So the remedy for this is to cut the scope. But we don't want to cut the scope, because if we cut the scope, then actually we're implementing an empty shell with nothing, right? So there will be no business value if we cut the scope to bare minimum, to bare zero. So service virtualization actually allows to save the time on all of those coordination efforts. Now let me go back to question number 2. In simple terms, possible. What is service virtualization in SAP? This one will be very quick. If we're talking about SAP programs, how does service virtualization work for the SAP S/4HANA Greenfield programs? Then basically it's just a simulation of third-party systems or non-SAP systems and EDI partners for the purpose of running the SAP S/4HANA Greenfield program. It's just this, right? It's nothing more complicated. It's just a simulation of all of those external systems that need to feed the data into our SAP S/4HANA system, or maybe they need to receive the data from the SAP S/4HANA system. Okay, let's go to the next question. Why should the SAP customers that are undergoing or planning a Greenfield SAP S/4HANA program think about using it in their projects? I like to answer this question in a maybe in a little bit more simple way. I think we all know how the pilot training program works, right? It's very simple. There are two types of trainings that every pilot needs to take. The first training is the simulator training, right? They spend countless hours and hours and hours in the simulator, right? Where the simulator is trying to mimic the real environment, the environment where you can make a lot of mistakes, where you can learn how to fly with a different weather, how to fly under very, very harsh conditions, how to make a landing in 100 different variants. This is what the pilots are doing in the simulator. So at first they do the simulator training, and only then, once they master the simulator training, then they go into the aviation training, where you cannot make any more mistakes, right? Because you've tried to test everything, you've tried to check everything in this simulator. Now you go to the aviation training, and this is the place where you actually cannot make any more mistakes, right? Or the mistakes that you will make you may need to work with someone who can correct them very quickly, at least at the beginning. But if you make a mistake in the aviation training, what happens? You go back to the simulator. So why the complexity of SAP programs make very often different SAP teams to think that they are way smarter and they can work without simulations. They can just skip the simulation and they can jump in directly into the aviation training. Why is it the case? Right? Why are we doing this? Why are we not making sure that we're actually using the models from different industries just to simplify our SAP Greenfield programs? It's the same with one of my other metaphors is testing the engines, right? How do you test the engine? Obviously, at first you simulate different conditions and you test the engine in the warehouse. Only then you can test it in the real plane. So my idea around to answer this question is just to think, okay, guys, how can we simplify the program to make it better, to make it more robust? Why don't we just use other models that can be immediately used for the SAP programs, and they can actually simplify and make it more robust? The next question we have very often is, what capabilities of SAP project teams get with the service virtualization that they didn't have before? And I think we need to go back to this pilot training, right? So what does the pilot get when they get into the simulator? They can try to fly the plane in the most craziest conditions, right? They can test all of the possible variants that would be very difficult to test in the real conditions. They can fly immediately, they can fly during the night, they can fly during the night in the rain, during the night in with the snow. They can test all of those craziest conditions. And what they can also do, then this is especially related to development and functional consultant customization in the SAP, they can test the same thing 50 times, 100 times without involving anyone else. They're just sitting in the simulator on their own. They have a full control. They do not need to involve anyone else just to be able to make a landing 50 times in snow, right? So this is something that the service virtualization gives. It gives the control to the SAP teams because they would be using those simulations, and it allows them to be prepared for the aviation training, for the real training, when all of the systems are already connected. This allows them to be ready for all of those different variants of business processes, of business transactions, even the crazy variants. They will already be ready because they simulated those variants before going into the real end-to-end testing. Yes, this is another question we get very often. What metrics do companies use to measure the impact of service virtualization in the SAP Greenfield programs? or projects? It's a very good question, because apparently right now we need to measure everything, because we need to show, in order to show the value, we need to measure something. Here I would like to give you one of the ideas. What is it that you can measure? And one of the things that you can measure is a time that a test can take of a single business process. Very simple measurement, right? And I'll give you an example from one of our customers, from one of the INT4 suite customers, and it was from an SAP S/4HANA Greenfield program. They said that before they started using service virtualization, before they started simulating non-SAP systems, a run of a complex project would take them 29 hours, right? In order to start the process, create the first transaction, then go back to another system, ask the other system to send them a confirmation message, create a new transaction, a following transaction, again, do the same thing a few times. And they said, it takes us 29 hours. With the use of service virtualization, they were managed to do it completely by the SAP team, so without interacting with the non-SAP team anymore. And they managed to do it in 4 minutes. So from 29 hours to 4 minutes, right? This is to run a test of a complex business process. This is a 400-time decrease in running this complex process. But if we're talking about the metrics, then this is it. It's the time to test a complex business process, or a transaction that is being invoked, or that is being integrated with a non-SAP system. Right? This is what we can measure very, very easily. And on the basis of that, we can show the value of the simulation of the service virtualization. Another question we get is, what usually stops companies from utilizing SAP Service Virtualization in the first place? I would say there are two things here. The first one is, you cannot use something you're not familiar with. So most of SAP programs, they're not familiar at all with the concept of service virtualization. Even though there are open SAP trainings about service virtualization, some of the biggest SAP S/4HANA programs in the world are using service virtualization. The concept is still relatively very, very new. So not a lot of companies are thinking about this. Okay, we need to have the service virtualization. We need to do the simulator training first before we go into the end-to-end testing. I think this is the first one. But the second one might also be related with some sort of bad past experience. So in the past, we still have a lot of service virtualization solutions which are absolutely not suitable for SAP programs. And we've had them in the past. They were not used. They were not used because the complexity to set them up was destroying completely the benefits that could be provided. Right? With INT4 Suite, we're bringing a completely different idea how to work with service virtualization, because we're doing a service virtualization on the integration platform. So the complexity is basically reduced to the bare minimum. So I would say these are those two things. You cannot use something you're not aware of, and maybe bad experience from the past from other service virtualization solutions that were working in a completely different way. How does SAP Service Virtualization allow you to avoid project delays? I mean, it speeds up the testing. Basically, it boils down to this simple thing. The service virtualization speeds up the testing because you have a full control. The SAP team can simulate all of the message exchanges that would be coming from tens or hundreds of non-SAP systems, tens or hundreds of EDI partners, without doing the interactions, without doing the ping pong. So the ping pong where you need to ask someone, hey guys, can you please send me a message? Actually, I wanted a different one. I want it with a different number, with a different material, with a different quantity. We can eliminate all of that for the simulation purpose, and that gives us the huge reduction of the testing time. And this is what allows us to avoid project delays, right? If we can do this string integration testing in 2, 4, 6 weeks without delaying this, without cutting the scope, this is what we can avoid, right? So we can avoid problems that we would have in the future, where if we would just do less testing, because simulation allows you to do more testing at the same time, and it allows you to not to cut down on the functionalities. You want to have more functionalities of the SAP S/4HANA because you need to deliver the innovation, right? The SAP S/4HANA implementation needs to bring some more innovation. And we don't want to cut down on this. We want to have this. One of the ways how to deliver this is to do a lot more simulator training, just like in the aviation. And in our case, this would be the simulation of non-SAP systems. Another question actually related to this one is, what can you actually simulate with the use of service virtualization for SAP S/4HANA Greenfield programs? I would answer this on a very high level. We can simulate all of the third-party non-SAP systems, all of them, all of those systems, all of the transactions, all of the master data transactions, they can be simulated. And you can also simulate all of your B2B or EDI partner exchanges. So all of this can be simulated on any landscape. You can start with a sandbox, you can start with the development, you can work on that very often with the string integration testing environment. The functional team will be able to use it. For them, it's just for the functional team, it's almost like using WE19 transaction for reprocessing IDOCs, but you can reprocess all sort of messages, all sort of transactions. You store them in a central database. You have a way to work with them on a very much centralized way. Oh, who in the organization is usually responsible for introducing the concept of the service virtualization into the project, and why? Here, I'm actually not sure if I have a very good answer to this, because it comes from all different sort of angles. Sometimes these are project or program managers. They just see that there is a problem with testing, and they're actually smart enough to understand, guys, but if we have 50 or 100 non-SAP systems, why don't we simulate first the 95, 99% of transactions, and only do the end-to-end testing when everything is working? So sometimes these are the program managers, SAP project managers. Very often this can be the testing teams. The testing teams that have used service virtualization successfully would always recommend this, because they know how much value does it bring. But program managers, testing teams, it's not only those guys. It's also the integration teams. The integration teams, just by the nature of the integration team, they work with hundreds of non-SAP systems with hundreds of interfaces. They know how complex it is to get a single message, to get someone to send you an EDI message. They understand it very, very quickly. And one of the ways they always try to find a ways to avoid this, right? And one of the ways to avoid this is to simulate this. And maybe let me go. I think there was a question from Ikram Lopez. How is service virtualization different from just mocking? I think you can look at it from a if we look at it from the high level perspective, these are the same things, right? What we want to do is we want to simulate the message. How intelligently are we able to do this? This might be the difference. Maybe in the mocking we would have to create some sort of a special endpoint. We would be able to do it in a less dynamic way. Maybe with the service virtualization we can do it in a little bit more smarter way. But ultimately it's the same thing. I would say from the high level, it's the same thing. What we want to do is we want to simulate the message exchanges from all of those non-SAP systems. I don't want to go into the details because for the purpose of SAP Greenfield implementations, there's no difference, right? How do you simulate the messages? It doesn't matter. As long as you simulate messages, right, you don't have to go to the real systems, then it's basically the same thing. Another question we were having is, in what phases of the project should we introduce the service virtualization to see the biggest benefits? The whole concept of the service virtualization of the simulator, and again, let me go back to the pilot training, is to do it as quickly as possible. So we can use service virtualization on the we should be using service virtualization on the development, because alternatively, what is it that the developers are doing? What kind of interfaces they're designing? They're designing an interface from a spreadsheet, from a documentation, right? It almost never works. The documentation almost never works. What if you take a historical message from a real system, and you just give the developers a way to repeat this as many times as they want, change it as many times as they want? So definitely we should be using from the earliest stages of the development as possible, so that we can design the interfaces already in the using the real messages, right? Using the simulated messages. But one of the phases that where service virtualization usually can easily save this phase is the string integration testing. So string integration testing is the place where we're doing a lot of functional tests, where we're doing a lot of smoke tests. Functional developers, functional consultants, they usually for this first phases of the string integration testing, they need to have tens or hundreds of simple messages. How do we provide it to them? Do they have to go to the real system to fetch them? Do they have to do this coordination effort? They should not be doing this. This is a place where they can really, really benefit from the service virtualization, because they can just go to the service virtualization solution and repeat as many transactions or simulate as many transactions as they want. They can do it constantly, day and day, right? So I would say the biggest benefits are in the early stages of the S/4HANA program. And these are there. If we come back to the shift left approach, these are the phases where it's not only the most beneficial but the most valuable, because the more we do, the more better development we do from the beginning, from the get-go, the better the string integration test, the better the UAT will be, right? So this is also one of the comments that we're getting when where our software is being used at the early stages of the program. So the funny thing is that very often the companies are saying, "Oh guys, but we've implemented simulation and we've got so many bugs right now, we're finding so many issues right now." Okay, this is really great, because you finally started doing a lot of testing, right? Where would you like to find those issues? Would you like to find them later? Would you like to find them in the set, or would you like to find them during the UATs? Or would you rather find them during the early stages of the development, or maybe even early stages of the SIT testing? So we come from this approach that the sooner you find the majority of issues, the better. And this is what the simulation gives you, right? This is why the pilots are going into the simulator to make as many mistakes as possible, as early as possible, so they can learn. Then when they go to the aviation training, there are no more mistakes, right? So I would say the earlier the better. The earlier the better. Another question is system virtualization allows you to simulate messages you normally get from third parties. How are the messages then created in a Greenfield program if we don't have any reference data? Yeah, this is a very valid question. How are we going to do this? How are we going to get the real messages? So basically, we have two ways of doing that. We can either ask the third-party system to provide us with a reference message, right? Very often those systems are already connected to some other systems, so we can get this data, so we can get the test messages. So we will get maybe 1 or 2 or 3 messages, and then during the simulation, we can start playing with them. We can add one more line, we can change the material, we can change the customer, we can change quantities. All of those variants will be stored in a service virtualization solution, and they will keep on building the number of test cases, right? So later on, you can just say, oh, out of those 2 messages, for my test, I'm using this 100 tests, right? So if you want to simulate a different material, it's here. If you want to simulate a different quantity, it's here. So one of the ways is to get the message. The second one is to create the message manually according to the specification. It's a little bit more difficult, I would say, but again, the benefits are still there, because if you create it once, anyone else from your team can use it. It's not only you, right? If you're a developer, you can create a message, the test is working fine, but then the message is gone. Usually the message is gone. No one can ever track it. No one can ever find it. With a service virtualization solution, you're building up a repository of all of those test cases that can be used forever. You can use them forever, right? So, and it's not only you, it's everyone from the team. It's not only the developers, it's the functional consultants. It's not only the functional consultants, it's the testing teams later on that can use those messages, right? So it's everyone that can benefit from those messages. But basically, these are the 2 ways. You either have to ask for a reference message, or you have to create a reference message. What does the use of service virtualization enable for companies aside of a single project? One of the biggest benefits of implementing a smarter way to run your SAP program, or a simpler way to run your SAP programs, is that you can innovate faster, right? The companies, SAP customers are not implementing SAP programs just to have it there. We need to think about innovation, right? Whether this is going to the cloud, whether this is maybe using some AI right now, which is very popular, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever kind of new functionality, whatever kind of innovation someone from the business wants, or maybe the customers want, you need to bring it into your system. Of course, you need to think about it, but whether it's valuable. But once the decision was made, you need to have a system, you need to have a framework, a structure that you can bring those innovation to your system. And how do you do it if you cannot, if you have to test a single change in your SAP system for 1 month? Because of the unavailability of the third-party systems, because of the unavailability of your EDI partners. How do you do this? So it's not a question, how can we speed up the testing? It's a question, how do we innovate faster? How can we introduce the changes that the business wants? How can we introduce them in a safe way so we can test them a lot? And we don't want to have a lot of defects in the end. We've got a question from Vitali. So with the service virtualization feature, can we skip the coordination with partners, or do we still need it? Vitaly, this is a great question. This is a brilliant question. I think that we can reduce this coordination dramatically, right? Because most of the testing, let's say 95% of the testing, we will do on our own. So during the development, during the first stages of the string integration testing, even during the UAT, we can do a lot of we can do a lot of simulations. At the end, probably for some of those vanilla flows, we would want to do it with the real systems, with the partners, but this will actually be done already. Everything will be tested. So we do not expect, first of all, we do not expect to do a lot of this coordination, just because we will just use them for a very small period of time. But then we do not expect a lot of coordination, because everything will be already tested so much with the simulation that there's no need to repeat anything. It's again just like with the pilots, right? All of those variants, all of the night mode, sunny mode, rainy mode, everything, the landings were already tested. So now we just have to do one more in real life. Yeah, let's do one more with a business partner, but that's it, right? So I would say we cannot eliminate this, but we can reduce it significantly. Another question from Bau Saheb. Is service virtualization more like a tool for project managers or testers? No, this service virtualization is the simulation feature is more for developers, functional consultants, and functional testers, right? Not for the project managers. They can only bring it in, right? When they see a problem, they can say, guys, but again, um, we've seen some other companies, so they were actually doing simulation instead of going to all of those 100 non-SAP systems and asking them for a single message on the development landscape. So if you have a smart project manager or program manager, he can recommend using this approach, but they will not be using this, right? It's developers, functional consultants in most cases, or functional testers, right? These would be the personas, I think, that would be using the service virtualization. Another question from Tim. Can you give an example of how this works? Do you use some sort of a tool? And how can we get the data for the simulations? Yeah, so there are a few questions here. So how can we get it? How can I give you an example? So let me give you an example how the customers of INT4 Suite, which is a service virtualization solution, they're using it. So for the Greenfield program, once they get one or two reference messages from the third-party system, we can put them into the database, and now we can start doing the simulations. So what does that mean? When we simulate, the messages will be sent to the integration platform, processed exactly as they would be if they would be sent from the real non-SAP system, and they land in the SAP Greenfield S/4HANA program. What you can do with those messages, you can change them, you can change the materials, as I mentioned, you can change quantities, you can add more lines, you can change partners. And once you do that, you're just building up the repository of all of those messages. So anyone else can use those messages for their tests. So if you're a developer, you've built up the number of test cases, you can say to the functional consultants, guys, I've tested this business process with those 50 messages. Why don't you use my folder just to test it right now in your scope, right? Because you're a functional consultant, you also want to do this. So this is what they would be doing. And the more we start doing that, the more repository grows. If we later on down the line, if we start communicating with the real system, we can fetch those real messages that were exchanged, and again, we can run them on any kind of other environment. So for example, if there was an exchange between a real system, a real non-SAP system, and an S/4HANA system, we can get those messages and we can resend them on the development environment, we can resend them on Sandbox, we can resend them on SIT environment, right? So this is, and again, we can change them to make sure that for example, the master data is different, or maybe we want to test different variants. Another questions come from Hati. Where does this time saving come from? What tasks get removed or automated? I think this is what we've discussed. What service virtualization is eliminating is basically the need to work and to coordinate tens or hundreds of people that need to take part in our S/4HANA implementation, but actually their main goal is not to do it, right? Because they're involved in they're working on the non-SAP systems. So for them, the implementation of S/4HANA is not the priority. Usually, it's not the priority. You have to ask them somehow. You have to beg them. You have to, once you get their acknowledgement, hey, we will help you, you have to coordinate this work. Because again, Hati, you have just a few weeks to do the testing of SAP. If you have 100 of non-SAP systems, you have to have a huge effort of coordinating all of those people to say, guys, but we just have 2 weeks in SAP. Our big SAP implementation team is waiting. Can you send the message? And they say, yeah, we can, but not right now. Maybe at the end of the day. Yeah, but we have 20 people waiting. Yeah, sorry, but we have other issues. We have maybe an incident, another priority. We cannot help you. This is what we're removing. This is the saving. But on the other hand, we're saving the time, but we're also making the SAP teams more powerful because they control the testing. They can say, oh, don't worry about those non-SAP guys. We will do the testing because we have a way to simulate this. And we can simulate this with 20 variants in 5 minutes. Right? So these are the tasks that are getting either removed or I would say dramatically reduced. Another question from RD, is there no data risk if you store these or compliance? Very good question. Of course there is. So this is why we need to implement, very often we need to implement masking or scrambling. And this is a part of most of the service virtualization solutions. And at INT4 Suite, this is one of the most core components because we're only working with big SAP S/4HANA programs. So yeah, we need to store the data in the safe place, and we need to be able to make sure that all of the GDPR specific rules are always compliant. We're always compliant with that. Can you then bring this data to your next project, the repository? Sujata, this is the main idea. This is the main idea that we store all of those simulations in a database, in a repository, in a big repository, so it can be used for not only for other projects, but even within the same project by other people, by other team developers. They can hand it over to the functional consultants. The functional consultants they can then help with the business. They can then help business users to use the same repository. And obviously, for the purpose of a new project, we can use the same data to do the regression testing, to help with the regression testing. A question from Kim, is service virtualization only for greenfield projects? Definitely not. Service greenfield programs are just one of the beneficiaries for the service virtualization. Most of the programs where the INT4 suite is used and its service virtualization capabilities are actually very complex, either bluefield or selective data transitioning or a brownfield SAP programs. So they use it for exactly the same purpose, but with the main difference between the greenfield programs is that greenfield programs are the only programs where you have to worry about creating the initial test cases, right? Because you may have to create it from scratch. If you have another kind of program, for example, a blue field or a selective data transition or a brown field, you can actually fetch hundreds or thousands of variants from the existing integration platform, and you can already start using this as your repository. So Kim, actually using the service virtualization for non-greenfield programs is much easier, I would say. In this session, we're just trying to show that it's also very beneficial for the greenfield programs, but for the non-greenfield programs, it's even simpler to set up. Aryun is asking, but if you have a repository, can you then automate the testing, or do you still do it manually after? A brilliant question. I would say that for greenfield implementations, there is, and guys, and please correct me. What is your experience with us? For greenfield programs, the use of automation is basically either very limited, or there is no use for test automation. This is what we've seen very often for SAP S/4HANA Greenfield programs. So the service virtualization would be used initially for the manual testing. So the developers would be using the service virtualization to do the manual testing during their work. The functional consultants would be using simulation for, again, their manual tests. The functional testers would be using that again for the same purpose. Even the testers later on would be using that, and the business, they can use it only for manual testing. Once we go from the Greenfield program, once we finish the Greenfield program, we go live, everything is working, then we start thinking about, okay, we have this huge repository. Why don't we automate some of those runs, some of those business processes, so that we can use the full power of automation? But this is the next step. If we're talking specifically about SAP S/4HANA Greenfield programs, I would say it's only for the manual testing, and all of those benefits that I've mentioned, those huge benefits, are for the manual testing only, right? So we're not talking about automating here yet. Automation comes after the Greenfield program, when we do the first rollout, or where we add some new features, new countries to the template. Yeah, so I think this is it today. We don't have any more questions. So thank you so much for watching. As I mentioned, if you'd like to learn more about the topic, then there is a free open SAP training, which is called Avoid S/4HANA Project Delays with System Virtualization, with Service Virtualization. And once again, this course is called our session is called Navigating SAP API Testing. We will be discussing more and more topics in the future. If you have any ideas about some other topics that you would like to cover, please feel free to get in touch with us. And yeah, we'd be looking forward to meet you during the next sessions. Thank you so much for the questions.